Waiting for people to join. So whoever joined, will you just let me know if this comes through? And just let me know if the shared screen is coming through or if it went black. Good. Okay. So now that we've done one session combining all the fields, all 6 sense fields, I now feel comfortable that we can finally talk about just sitting and doing nothing at all. So, just sitting practice, once again, I think extremely profound practice. I think extremely effective practice. You find versions of this in sutra level Tibetan Mahamudra, something like this in Dzogchen, in my humble understanding of Dzogchen. And there is a Taoist practice as well called Zhuoang. And I apologize if anyone speaks Chinese. My accent is probably atrocious, which means sitting and forgetting. That's the practice that I was mentioning the other day. Also, if I follow my little hyperlink here, there's at least in Sadhguru's modern Hindu style teaching, he teaches a just sitting style meditation as well. So if we were to just, oh yes, but I've seen no indication in my reading of Hindu material on meditation. I've seen no indication that the Buddhist ones came from the Hindu ones. However, there is some indication that the Buddhist ones that came through China in the form of Chan and then Zen, and then I believe it's called Quan, if I'm not mistaken. So China, Japan, Korea. So Zen style practice, Chan style practice, Jhana style practice. All of these words mean the same thing, just transliterated across different languages. May have been influenced by Taoist Zhuoang practice. There is one text that is reminiscent, at least, of Taoist Zhuoang that predates any mention of a just sitting style practice in China. And I think the earliest mention of something like a just sitting style practice in China is like the 11th century, like somewhere around there, somewhere between the 7th century and the 11th century. And it's quite often called a transmission outside the sutras. In other words, it's sorry, someone just sent a comment through. It's called a transmission outside the sutras. In other words, it's a teaching that they say you can't find in the sutras. So there's some indication that maybe maybe the Buddhists borrowed this technique from the Taoists in China, and then it went from China to Japan to Korea. However, the only caveat to that, which is a pretty strong caveat, I would say, is that you find practices that are basically identical in the form of at least sutra level Tibetan Mahamudra, for example, which doesn't seem to have come from China. It seems to be its own animal. So whether or not it was Taoist originally and became Buddhist, or it was Buddhist but legitimately was outside of the sutra transmissions and was instead in the tantric transmissions, who knows? In any case, that is the extent of the history lesson for today. What's more important is just sitting style practice is perhaps the most, in terms of those teachings that are considered to be amongst the most profound in every system, right? You can find systems that have all sorts of practices that they say are the most profound that are not shared in common with other systems. But amongst those things that are considered the most profound practices, and there's a small handful of those, just sitting is one that you find in Taoism, Buddhism, several different strains of Buddhism, including Tibetan Buddhism and Zen or Chan, and you find it in Hindu practice. So finding it, in my opinion, across such a wide spectrum of practices means that basically everyone agrees this is really important if you want to achieve incredible spiritual ends, let's say. So the reason that, as you can tell, I mean, we've spent the whole 5 days really building up to this practice, right? Combining all 6 sense fields is because, as you experienced this morning, if you did this morning session, it's really difficult. And if you did, my laptop came unplugged there. If you did the just trying to be aware of consciousness, you probably found that that was not easy either. You know, I would be surprised if, even though we sat for an hour last night, if anyone had an experience of consciousness where all 5 external senses turned off for ability that are required for these practices. It's really not easy to develop them. Now you can do it by force, in a sense, if you just do a huge amount of just sitting, where all the work that we've done to build up the sense gates and calm the nervous system down, you could just skip all that and do 4-hour sessions of just sitting meditation a day with virtually no instructions other than sit still, do nothing, and if you notice that you've done something, stop it and go back to doing nothing. Eventually, with enough just do nothing, the senses will open, and then you'll gain an experience of consciousness. Especially if you're sitting there in like a Soto Zen style facing the wall with absolutely nothing to stimulate you, and someone standing behind you with a stick who's going to whack you if you start doing something instead of doing the exercise. Because I know some of you have been wandering around and drinking tea and trying to leave your body and go visit places and do all sorts of things that are not the instructions for the practice. If a senior monk noticed you trying to leave your body while doing just sitting, he'd whack you with a stick. Okay? So, in brief, this class of meditative techniques involves long seated sessions, physical stillness, and simply allowing the fundamental nature of consciousness that we have been exploring through the 6 sense gates, simply allowing the fundamental nature of consciousness, which gives rise to experiences and experiences those experiences, to just naturally dissolve thoughts, feelings, and at least the most coarse levels of what you think you are, which is mostly just a bunch of sort of storytelling and habit. You can imagine much of your self-identity has to do with your preferences, your habits, your predispositions, the ways that you naturally react to things. You think, well, that's me. I'm the type of person that loves chocolate. I'm the type of person that hates whatever, the Green Party. Or I'm the type of person that loves the Green Party, right? Whatever. So our sense of identity has much to do with the ways that our mind has been trained or trained to react to things or naturally reacts to things, which once again has quite a bit to do with then our thoughts and our feelings about things. And so if you sit in a condition where the mind is not reacting, where the mind is not deciding, where the mind is not doing, it's not intentionally engaged in any action, and whatever appears, it simply allows it to appear like a mirror, and then, like a mirror would allow something to appear in it, and then it just dissolves back and the mirror carries on reflecting just as it was. Doing this in choiceless and intentionless awareness, the mind naturally becomes lucid and stable, right? You've already experienced a little bit of this firsthand training with me in the last 4 years. So this isn't theoretical for you anymore. This is something that you can say, yeah, I know. This is what happens. So because I think modern people don't have as much time to devote to these practices, and or they don't have as much inclination, much easier to learn how to open each sense gate, learn how to rest the mind on each sense gate, and then when you have the time and inclination, you can do, you should do some seated practice every day, but then you can do longer seated sessions where you just sit. You just sit, allow the sense gates to open, and you do nothing, right? Let me see here. Again, the key point is, once again, I explained how it is that you move while you're in a meditative posture. Eventually, after years of doing this, you won't need to move as much, or you won't need to move at all. The key point is, in terms of your posture, you want to have a straight spine. And then slowly over the course of the years, really, you let go of intent, let go of making a choice, let go of deliberately doing anything. So to use an example from last night, someone said, well, I dropped into the awareness of consciousness, and then I felt my body became very, almost like a balloon. It kind of filled up, and the body felt really nice. So on the one hand, the object of meditation, once again, go back to the description of training on the first stage, right? You place your attention on the breath. The object of meditation is the breath and the numbers, counting, right? So you're dividing your attention between the counting and the breath. Anything else that happens, you have lost the activity. You're no longer engaged in the activity you intended to do. So if the object of meditation is the sixth consciousness, is consciousness itself, mental awareness, and then your mind becomes aware of the body, you've lost the object. If the mind becomes aware of sound, you've lost the object. If it becomes aware of smell, you've lost the object. Now, of course, it's going to take a long time for you to close all 5 external senses completely and only focus on consciousness. That's going to be really hard, and it's going to take a lot of time. But if your mind is getting actively involved with observing the body and doing all of this, then you have lost the activity. You're now doing something else. And the bigger project we're engaged in is being able to control your mind, know where your mind is at any given time, and each of your activities is deliberate. You're doing everything on purpose. You're not doing anything unconsciously. So the other thing this person said was that they put their attention on consciousness, and it seemed like their consciousness, because of this, was a little bit more liberated from the body. And so they decided they were going to go try to look at the local railway station and their work. Now, The instructions were to rest in choiceless and intentionless awareness. If you generate an experience of consciousness and it detaches from the five senses a little bit, and then you go, I wonder what's happening at the railway station. You've now made a choice, and you've set an intent and a goal, and you've aimed the mind to go engage in some activity that you think is more interesting than sitting there and just watching your mind. So the instructions are very simple. If you're opening the mental sense gate, you make the mind like a mirror, and anything mental, critical point that appears in the mind, you observe those. You are not observing tactile sensation, smell, taste, sound, or vision, right? You are not observing the objects of the external five senses. And you are certainly not taking a trip to the local railway station using only your consciousness. So what you're doing in this state, remember the instructions from last night. The instructions from last night were, before we got started with consciousness, I said, okay, imagine that you're touching a tree with your hand, and you can feel the tactile sensation of touching the tree. But it's consciousness that's feeling that sensation as an imagined experience. So that experience of the tactile sensation of a tree that you're imagining is a mental object. Your hand can't touch the tree you're imagining. If you take a bite of an apple, after you visualize an apple and you take a bite, the taste you're experiencing is a mental object because you're basically visualizing that taste. Your tongue isn't tasting anything. And so the object that you're tasting is a mental object. And you're tasting it using mental consciousness. You're not using your tongue consciousness to taste that experience, right? When you have a memory of something from the past, when you have a hope or expectation or imagine something from the future, when you have a thought about emotion, or when your mind decides it's going to do something, all of those are mental objects. They're mental phenomenon that are only observed by your mental consciousness. Okay? So those are the unique objects of mental consciousness. Remember, each of your six senses has unique objects. Your tongue is the only part of you that can experience tastes, actual tastes, physical tastes. Your nose is the only thing that can experience actual physical smells. Your ears, the only thing that can experience actual physical sounds. The body, the only thing that can experience actual tactile sensations. And the eyes, the only thing that can experience actual physical colors and shapes. Mental consciousness is the only thing that can experience mental phenomenon, which are defined as any sort of visualized or imagined sensory experience, your memories, your emotions, your thoughts. So when you're observing mental phenomenon, you need to be quite specific about what activity you're engaged in. Otherwise, your mind, by way of analogy, we don't really need an analogy. Your mind will just be running back and forth between the different sense gates. You understand? You set your intent to be fully in the consciousness sense gate and only observe what appears to that sense gate. And instead, it's jumping from the mental sense gate to the body sense gate, and then back to the mental sense gate, and then to the sound sense gate, and then from the mental sense gate to the vision sense gate. And it's jumping all over the place. So if you've set the intent to solely be in mental consciousness and to only observe mental phenomena, then any other experience coming through the five senses is ultimately a distraction. Now, as with everything else we've done, of course, there's a training process. So you don't want to get frustrated and just go, oh, well, I suck at this. I'm never going to be able to do that. It's about bandwidth. For now, think about it as bandwidth. If you can get 7, 8, 9 points of your bandwidth, your mental bandwidth, into the mental consciousness and everything else is sort of gray, that's fine. But while doing that, if you then have the inclination to chase your intention or your choice making process or following things out of the body, et cetera, again, you've lost the activity because the mind is meant to be like a mirror. Choiceless, intentionless awareness. Choiceless, intentionless awareness. Choiceless, intentionless awareness. The awareness itself is doing nothing whatsoever other than abiding in its own nature and observing what comes up. It is a kala. It is fudomyo. It is sitting completely still at the center of reality. Okay. So the way that I teach just sitting practice, I teach it in 2 levels, and the 3rd level I can't do myself, so I don't teach it. So the first level, the prerequisite is you need to be able to open all 6 of your sense gates and keep them open simultaneously. If you can't do that, then I don't understand how you would just sit in a short period of time. Again, if you had 4 hours or 16 hours a day and this is all you were going to do, sure, you could do just sitting and be successful in that. And that's very profound. But if you're like me and maybe you have 30 minutes or an hour when real life hits to do practice, this is one way to drop into just sitting. So as we did this morning, we'll do it one more time now. You simply sit with all 6 sense gates open. Again, this is not easy at all, but I think it is the easiest way to get into a just sitting condition. This practice, again, I think is most effective if you can do an hour or more. But if you can only do 10 minutes, you've noticed already 10 minutes is fantastic. 15 minutes, great. 30 minutes, great. Any amount of any of these practices you can do, from personal experience now, will have an effect. And those effects will build up if you do them day by day, and you'll have more and more profound experiences because of doing them. However, again, I think an hour or more, eventually, long term, let yourself grow into it naturally. Like we did last night, it was just a natural thing that we did more, and it was not too hard for most of us, right? It should be organic. Furthermore, even though it's called just sitting, this is a practice that you can do standing. It's a practice you can do laying down. It's a practice you can do walking. Just sitting style practice where the all 6 sense gates are open is a practice that you can do during any activity whatsoever. Any activity. If you'd like a really, really excellent book on this, I'll put the link in the description below. Takwon Soho's book, The Unfettered Mind. It's a book written by a really fantastic Zen monk who was writing to one of the greatest swordsmen of Japan. And he was trying to explain to this swordsman how it is that you maintain the condition that we're talking about here in the midst of with another person holding a sword. So this is a condition you can maintain at any and all times, even under the most extreme conditions. Okay, so I'm just going to then now describe level 2 because we already did it last night. So level 2 is to focus on the consciousness gate only. So eventually you'll find a gap between one thought or image or memory, etc., and the next. And when you see that gap, you simply, again, you just, those gaps between thought become more and more and more, and eventually the mind is just resting in its own clarity and awareness with no obvious content of any kind other than the fact that it knows that it is clear and aware. And so it rests in this condition, and eventually the five external sense gates close completely, and you're simply resting in consciousness as consciousness, without choice, without intention, without content, or without content beyond itself. And in that condition, you then simply absorb or rest on choiceless, conceptless, intentionless awareness itself. And I think you know from experience now, this is not just my opinion, you know from direct experience, it's much, 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 much easier to do that practice if you can do the first level of practice. If you can open the five external sense gates and then open consciousness, much easier to try to then absorb in consciousness afterwards for a number of reasons that you can sort of figure out on your own. Not the least of which is you have trained to not react to what appears in your other senses. Does that make sense? Since you've already trained really hard to not react to what appears in the other five sense gates, and you can just sort of relax those sense gates and pull awareness back and be like a mirror with all five external senses, now when you try to not react and pull back and just look at consciousness only, well, now the external five senses are way less reactive than they were. They don't pull you as much as they did, and it's much easier to absorb just on consciousness only. As a small side note, it's possible to move straight from some type of breath meditation practice straight over to meditating on consciousness. I don't teach it that way because, once again, I think it's hard if you're living a normal lay person life to do it that way. But there are methods where you basically go straight from breath style practices to a number of other breath practices or body practices, and then on to consciousness. And in my humble experience, that's how things like Goenka practice and Thai forest practice tend to work, from my limited experience of those practices, which works just fine. So eventually, if you want to try those approaches or someone teaches you that way, I think that's just fine. And then finally, I'm just putting this here to plant a seed for those of you who are interested at some later time. So level 3, there are methods in Buddhist Tantra, highest yoga Tantra, and in my humble opinion, those methods are shared substantially in common with Taoist Neidan, and they're probably also shared in common with Hindu practices like Kundalini, not the really crappy, weird lineages where they're just trying to make money, but the real thing. And I'm not going to describe how these work because that would be totally inappropriate, but there are techniques in things like Highest Yoga Tantra, Kundalini, and Taoist Neidan to trigger the subtlest types of consciousness that exist. So when you absorb on consciousness from doing the 6 sense gates, as we've been working on this weekend, what you're generating or experiencing is, for lack of a better term, the human level of consciousness. It is your human level of consciousness, and from a tantric perspective, that is a fairly coarse or gross or sort of surface level of consciousness, as profound as it is. And if you could close the sense gates and absorb on it with no mental images and so forth appearing, it would change the rest of your life. So to call it coarse or not very subtle or whatever is a bit like it only looks that way if you have something that is way more subtle. Okay. From our standpoint, it's incredibly subtle already. But even subtler than this, there are four very, 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 very subtle minds that only generally occur when you're dying. When your human mind has dissolved, and it dissolves into these extremely subtle, extremely refined minds, one of which, called clear light or Rigpa, is the mind that actually moves from lifetime to lifetime. So it's not your human consciousness that moves from lifetime to lifetime. It is this extremely subtle mind that acts as the sort of the thing that continues, right? Okay, so level 3 of Mahamudra style practice, for example, you would use various techniques to generate clear light while you're still alive. And then instead of absorbing on the sixth sense gate, instead of absorbing on mental consciousness, you would generate clear light, which is an extremely subtle type of mental consciousness, way subtler than normal. And then you would absorb on that. And in your Mahamudra practice, right? To highlight that term one more time, because this is one of the main practices for the lineage that I belong to. So then in your Mahamudra practice, at the sutra level, you're doing this, opening the six sense gates, and then you're absorbing on consciousness, right? So that's the sutra level of this practice, the sort of open level, if you will, the not secret level. And then the secret level, you use various techniques to generate clear light. And then instead of resting on consciousness at sort of the human level of consciousness, you rest on this extremely subtle mind that normally only occurs at the time of death. And then while you're resting on that mind, you can join it with your understanding of emptiness or your understanding of selflessness, which are very, very, very important concepts in Buddhist study and practice. Some of you are already very familiar with those. And for those of you who are not, basically what it means is that everything always exists interdependently. And so when you look at any individual thing and you try to find something existing independently, you can't find it. So in a sense, it's like you open up a piece of luggage and you expected that inside there would be this independently existent thing. You open the luggage, and when you look for it, the luggage is empty. It's not in there, right? Or you are looking for an independently existent self that exists somehow utterly independently, and you open the luggage, and there's no self like that inside, right? Instead, all that's there is the luggage. All that's there are these 6 components that we've been working with over the weekend that make you up. The 5 senses and consciousness and clear light, and then also your subtle body and subtle energies and so forth, which we didn't deal with. So all that's there are these components that are all interdependent. So that's yourself, are these interdependently existent things. But unfortunately, we see ourselves existing as if we existed independently, utterly independently. And then on the basis of that, we give rise to attachment and aversion. And then on the basis of all of those, we give rise to jealousy, arrogance, and deluded forms of doubt. There are good forms of doubt, and there are deluded forms of doubt. And then we give rise to a whole host of other negative mental factors like non-consideration, just being inconsiderate of others, for example. So it's kind of a minor one. Or being haughty, which means to sort of, you strut around like a rooster, you know. So there are all these minor negative mental factors that then piggyback on the major ones. But the major ones are exaggerating the positive qualities of things, attachment, raga, and exaggerating the negative qualities of things, pratika, sometimes called anger or aversion. And then at the center of it all is ignorance, which means seeing things existing utterly independent of the interdependent way in which things actually exist. And when you point that understanding at the self, then we would call it selflessness. That the self that actually exists interdependently seems, when you look at a person, when you look at yourself in the mirror, when you think about your own self, seems to exist independent of some kind of interdependently originated process, right? So that self doesn't exist. And if you were to point that awareness at a table, the table, when you look at it, seems to exist sort of almost unchanging, or at least it can be unchanging for periods of time. And then there's something about it, it seems, that makes it a table from its own side that has nothing to do with me. That's how it seems. But when you look for that particular thing that makes it what it is, that makes it a table, you can't find that thing. There's no one particular thing. There's a whole set of causes and conditions that makes it a table for a period of time. And that thing isn't something you can find existing in the way that it appears. It appears like it's just a table over there, and that has nothing to do with me. It's a table whether I'm here or not. That's how it seems, right? But when you investigate closely, you can't find the table existing that way, which shows or proves that it must exist a different way. And we explain that other way it exists as interdependent origination. So finally, at level 3, once you have generated clear light using the techniques from Highest Yoga Tantra, or maybe perhaps one of these other systems, then you can join that subtlest mind with your understanding of selflessness and or emptiness. And that is the final sort of just sitting meditation, where you rest in the subtlest state of mind, being aware of how things actually exist. Before we do that, at the sutra level, at the non-secret, before you do all the tantric stuff, which you should not jump into, by the way, actually, this weekend, before we finish the weekend, we're going to do some work on this, where once you can open the consciousness sense gate and you become aware of the final piece that makes you up, right? We have vision, smell, taste, touch, the ability to hear. So we have these 5 external components, and then we have mind and all of the stuff that appears in our mind. Those are all of the parts of ourself that we can sort of look at directly at this stage of the game, besides our energy body, which you can experience through your tactile body mainly. So once you can experience the consciousness gate, then, similar to how I described with the conjoining it with your understanding of selflessness in Tantra, at the level of sutra or non-secret practice, you can do the same thing here, where you can start to analyze, well, where is this self that is normally appears there when I'm not doing this practice? Where exactly, when I look really closely at consciousness, is this self that I thought was there? And there's the potential, now that you can contact all 6 sense gates, that you can directly see that this self you thought was there isn't there at all. And especially if you do it in regards to consciousness, this becomes a very, very, very profound practice, because consciousness is the thing ultimately that is generating everything else you experience. So it becomes very profound, very, very profound. But I'll say this: don't jump into that on your own. Don't do it willy-nilly, just sort of however. Stick with the practices as we're going to do them throughout the day, and we will get to it, okay? We'll get to it, and we're going to do it in a systematic way because you don't want to drive yourself nuts. You do exist. You are here. You are experiencing everything. Things are real. It's just we have a couple of mistakes in the way that we see ourselves and see the world, and those mistakes are quite serious. So we're going to do some work on that as the day progresses. Okay, I'll be back with you at 9 o'clock London time, and we'll get back into practice. Okay, now that we've explained everything. Have a good break.